We are in what will be part 2 of Genesis 6. There's a huge amount of material that is concerning this Genesis 6. So what I want to do is I want to start out, I'll just say this, last week our technology wasn't too good in some of the pictures. I'm sorry about that. I think we've done better this week. Fortunately, my friend Joe, who runs the site, I think cleaned it up, so I want to thank him so much. But so at any rate, let me start. What I'm gonna do is I'm going to turn the camera to the screen here, because we've got a variety of different photos, pictures, charts, and things like that you're going to see on the screen. So I'm going to turn this around, try to adjust this so that you all can see on the screen better. So let me do this. Okay. Now I'm going to lower this to here, and I'm going to bring this to there, and hopefully that shows up pretty well. All right. Okay. Now let's start on this. Now, remember that last week we stopped because we showed evidence of giants in Babylon and Samaria. We showed evidence of giants in Egypt. We then went to Greece, and we showed evidence of giants in Malta and Crete. We showed archaeology. We showed historical narratives. We showed inscriptions. We showed bas-relief, that all were about giant people. Now, what I went over last week and what I'm going to go over this week, I'm scratching the absolute tip of the iceberg. Okay? I mean, I can only do a little bit, or else we're going to be here for a long time in Genesis 6. So, at any rate, I'm just touching a little bit, but I'm trying to give you enough to show you the extent of the evidence of giants. Okay? So, basically, we're going now this week.
Can you scoot your chair back just a little?
Okay. We're going this week through especially the Midwest of the United States. Now, there is plenty of evidence on the East Coast. I'll point here. Okay. There's plenty of evidence also on the West Coast. There is a reasonable amount of evidence of giants here. There's somewhat less so in the Plain States. Okay. But what we find is that the greatest density of all the giants is right here, okay, which would happen to be the state that we're in right now. Now, we see that it's especially the Ohio Valley. It includes the northern part of West Virginia. There's a lot of mounds there. There's a lot of giant skeletons taken out of that area. It also includes, obviously, what we just said in Ohio. It includes somewhat of western Pennsylvania and southern Indiana to some extent. So you see that chart, it's a representation kind of the relative numbers of giant skeletons that have been found. Okay? I think you would conclude that's a lot. Now, certainly many books have been written about the giants. Certainly one of the ones that, there's a lot of them. Certainly one of the ones that that I've enjoyed certainly is Steve Quayle's book on the giants. Actually, I have it over here. Additionally, what you see in his book and in a variety of other books written are articles in newspapers and sometimes pictures, especially from the 1850s through the early 1900s, okay, with the following theme in almost all cases. The theme is this. Number one, someone digs into a mound or riverbank and finds a large skeleton or large skeletons. Number two, the county coroner gets called, who comes to that site, assesses the morphology, takes careful measurements, and records it. Number three, a reporter of a local newspaper comes in, interviews the people, interviews who dug it out, interviews the coroner often, and either writes and sometimes later has photo of it, okay, documenting it. And number four, the Smithsonian is called, comes to it, boxes up all the bones, and they're never seen again. Over and over and over and over. Okay? Now, if you want to call that a conspiracy, I'll raise my hand. I'm a conspiracy theorist then, because I think that is done by the Smithsonian extremely deliberately. Okay? Now, one of the things that's very interesting is that in the 1840s, there was topological survey by two gentlemen named Squire and Davis. Do you think that you can turn that and see if we can find even the front of the book of Squire and Davis? I don't know where it might be. So Squire Davis is right here. Thank you. Okay, now, Squire Davis were commissioned by the federal government. They were surveyors, okay? I think it was Davis also was quite an artist. And what they did is they were commissioned to go between the spring of 1845 and the summer of 1847 to investigate the Ohio Valley, okay? They were to draw maps, find rivers, find Indian villages, look at mounds, find earthworks all over the Ohio Valley. Okay, they actually went further than the Ohio Valley eventually. They also went further south eventually. But so what happens is that they then were to file reports of all these things with all the drawings and all the measurements. And then we have this book that you'll see here, The Ancient Monuments of the Mississippi Valley. It's an absolutely incredible book. It's filled with drawings. Why don't you let's show maybe Chillicothe, some of the stuff there in terms of drawings. We could do Newark, we could do, yeah, one of these. Okay, go ahead, that's fine. Okay, now, these are the drawings of Squire Davis concerning earthworks. What you should note, and you can't appreciate it without looking at it and studying it more carefully, is these are unbelievable geometric elements that are put together in a way that if you look at, for instance, they'll measure the radius of these circles, and they'll realize that the radiuses are in certain proportions over and over and over again. They'll measure the square areas, they'll measure, all the elements of it, and they find that in many of these, not all, but many of these, they are astroarchaeological sites. And one of the most famous astroarchaeological sites, if you'll go to, is to go to the Newark Earthworks. Okay, which is right here.
This one?
Yes, should be. Now, this is a map of the Newark Earthworks. We have a couple here who lives, a few miles from them?
Probably a mile.
Yeah, okay. There's a golf course, interestingly, that was built I think in 1930s, it was,
Something like that.
on this area, but they didn't devastate it. They tried to preserve most of it. This is an extremely complex astroarchaeological site. It shows everything. It shows the solstices. It shows the equinoxes. It shows the lunar declination cycle. Okay, the lunar declination cycle, if you don't know what it is, because not everyone studies lunar declination, but what it is that it's the cycle of the apparent movement of the moon from its northernmost areas to its southernmost areas, okay? It is a cycle of 18.61 years. Now, if you think that some Native American sat on a hill day and night for 18.61 years to chart it out, you want to believe that, that's up to you. I don't. You know, I think this is information that was given. Remember, all these things are given to people that we have no evidence that they knew math. You're talking about the Native Americans in this area. We have no evidence, okay? So it seems to me incredibly implausible that these things could have been devised by them and seem to have come from a higher source. That higher source, we believe, were the fallen angels, okay, and the giants. All right, now, as a result of their survey data, Squire and Davis estimated in their report that there were over 10,000 mounds just in Ohio. 10,000 mounds, okay? These were all spiritually active sites because there were burials, there were rituals that occurred in these mounds, and of course, out of many of them, not all of them, but out of many of them, we've pulled giant skeletons, and I'll show you in a minute. Why don't you turn, okay, why don't you turn to, go back, I want to show this. I want you to show, okay, where is it? It's the HA map.
Middle to the left.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yes, there you go, sorry. So if you can put that up, and if you can make it bigger. Good, okay, very good. Now, this is also a mound map. All the red dots are mounds. This is a 1913 survey map, so a lot of the mounds are gone because of agriculture.
It says 1940.
1914, okay? So, but even then, here's what's left. And what you'll find is really fascinating, at least to me, is that probably the greatest density of all mounds in the state of Ohio is in Licking County, okay? The Newark area, okay? It then moves as density through this area, through Pickaway County, okay? And moves down this way, okay, to Ross County. Chillicothe. Interestingly enough, there was an ancient road that occurred called the Hopewell Road between Newark and Ross County and Chillicothe. Chillicothe is filled with mounds. There's still quite a few of them down there, even now, that still exist. Licking County just had innumerable mounds all over it. Now, I want to show you also, I showed you the Newark Earthworks. I want to show you another interesting element, and that is I want you to go back and show Serpent Mount. Okay, let's go to this one first. Okay, now this is a drawing, okay? Certainly there are many, many pictures, but this is a drawing of Serpent Mount. And it also is an astroarchaeological site. It is built on a plateau. You can see the river here in the front of it, okay? It has 7 coils, and again, it predicts the solstices, the equinoxes, the lunar declination cycle, the midpoints between them, based on how you run lines through the middle of the coils. Okay? It's all been mapped out in an incredible book, which if you want to be a nerd, you can read by Ross Hamilton, called Serpent Mound. It's an unbelievable book where he not only analyzes all this data, but shows you the geometry of it, which is really fantastic what he did. This was excavated by Harvard archaeologist named Putnam in the 70s, maybe early 80s. Originally, what was found up here, okay, in this area, was a mound, and in that mound, and I'll show you in a second, was a 7-foot skeleton. Now, this mound, if you'll see it, it is quite clearly a serpent. And what is the serpent doing?
About to devour something.
About to devour an egg. Okay? Genesis 3:15. The seed of the serpent. The seed or ovum of the woman. Okay? It's estimated the Serpent Mound is probably at least 5,000 years old. It was originally, it's now a grass mound, if you go see it, okay, about maybe, 3 feet tall, 4 feet tall. But originally, they've cut into it, obviously. It originally was a ceramic clay mound that was fired. So it was like ceramic, okay? It is an absolutely fascinating site. This draws New Age people like crazy. It draws people even from Central America that will come here. I mean, there's many times that Mayan, quote unquote, priests have come to Serpent Mound and channeled things. The Serpent Mound is a very, very spiritually active place. Okay?
Were people glazing tile 5,000 years ago, though?
Sure.
They were.
Yeah.
I just wondered if it was even advanced.
Yeah,
for that.
they were doing it in around that time. I mean, that's equivalent, even a little bit younger than the ancient Babylonian Sumerian culture. We have what, tens of thousands of their fired clay tablets they wrote on? Yeah. Now, also, let's go to another one I want to show you that I think is quite interesting, and that's this one.
Looks like a scorpion.
This is called Alligator Mound. Alligator Mound, you can go visit it today. It's 1 mile to the east of Granville, Ohio. Okay? I've been there multiple times and looked at it and studied it. You can't see it from this viewpoint, but it's on top of a prominence. And I'm sorry, it would be this way. And there's a valley down here, and then the river in the valley. They call it Alligator Mound. That's completely ridiculous to call it Alligator Mound. What's an alligator going to do in Ohio?
Nothing.
Nobody knew a alligator in Ohio. But interestingly enough, it is a very famous Native American Indian mound. Actually, the lake tribes, Eries and all the lake tribes, okay, would come and visit this, and it is they worshipped or did homage to this god of theirs called Mississippi. Mississippi was the god of water, the god of streams, the god of lakes. The Native Americans would be frightened to go across the lake often because they called him the lake dragon. And that's really what is supposedly depicted there. It's called the lake dragon. And they would actually take offerings like grain and tobacco, if they're on the canoe, and throw them in the water to try to appease Mississippi. Now, it's interesting. The other major element that they had
Was Mississippi a smoker? Tobacco?
well, yeah, I guess, or like to eat it, chew it, whatever. There's also another major element. I'm going a little off track here by saying this, but they also worship the Thunderbirds. Okay? Now, who has been down to the Silver Bridge crossing the Ohio River at Point Pleasant?
Yeah.
Anyone been down there?
I know where.
Okay,
Mothman's?
yeah. Now, in December of 1967, I believe, and there's a movie about it by Richard Gere called The Mothman Prophecy. Okay, there are, I don't know how many newspaper articles are written during that time about people seeing this tall, black, well, really, it's a thunderbird is what it is, creature, okay, with glazing, burning red eyes that showed up all over the place. Tons of people saw it. Newspapers wrote about it furiously during that time in 1967. And of course, right at the height of this, what happens? Just before Christmas 1967, the Silver Bridge collapses, and I think 55 people died in the river as a result.
It's awful. I crossed that bridge a lot.
Yeah, I'm certain you did, because obviously it goes from West Virginia to Ohio.
Mhm.
Now, it's interesting because that, well, I think it's an interesting connection that this tragedy happened, because it happens as a result of seeing this thunderbird in the air, but obviously who's allegedly in the water?
The wife.
Miss Epilogue. And it's a connection between these two. There's a lot more in this. I won't go into it now. If you want my nerdish self to tell you all about it, I've studied it quite a bit. But anyway, now, let me go on. Now, in May 18th, 1885, in the Newark Advocate newspaper, there's a story of two schoolboys digging in a hillside near the Licking River, and they, in other words, right in this little town called Homer, Ohio, where they found two giant skeletons, one measuring 8 feet and one measuring 12 feet. Could you bring up the picture of Homer? Yeah. Okay, this is an aerial picture of Homer. Now, Homer, to me, and I've spent a lot of time in Homer, okay, probably too much time in Homer, right? Homer has a very unique topography and history. If you look at a map, like that map we showed of the 1914 archaeological mound sites, you find that surrounding Homer were at least 20 mounds within about 1 square mile, okay? This is one of the existing mounds called Dixon Mound. This is the library. If you go into Homer and park in the library lot, you can go walk to the Dixon Mound, okay? It has a very interesting history. I'll say this if people are interested at all. A friend of mine, who some of you know, Pastor Steve Mitchell, who has passed away sadly, we did a lot of investigation on Homer. We dug out a lot of, I think, very fascinating things. We called the series Entities and Effigies. That is, the effigies are the mounds and the entities are the spiritual, malignant, demonic presence of the mounds. And if you want to see what we dug up, you can go in the archives of my YouTube channel. You got to go back quite a long way, probably, I don't know, 3 years back. And you'll see in those archives, there are 5 sessions of what we call effigies and entities. And 2 of them are about Homer, Ohio. Now, Homer is very interesting, okay? Not only does it have the ancient mound site here, okay? Across the street from the mound is a cemetery. I'm going to tell you, I've been there many times, and I do not enjoy that cemetery.
Creepy.
It is creepy. In that cemetery, they've done LiNAR, laser from the air assessments. It appears that there's two things underneath that cemetery. One of them is what is called, or it looks like, quote unquote, a sun temple. That is a megalithic round site that, of course, again, is predictive of the solstices, the equinoxes. It appears to be down below it. On top of it was built in various places, okay, Indian burials, Native American burials that were done there because the Licking Valley Historical Society talks about them in their documents in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, just before and some during the time of the early pioneers. When the pioneers came in to Homer, then they decided that they didn't want, obviously, a Native American site, okay? So they decided to destroy it and build a pioneer cemetery on top of it. So that's what you're looking at today. There's probably 3 levels of things on that thing. Now, up here, you can't really see this because that's actually a field right there, okay? But right here along this edge, you see, here is the Licking River, all right? It's a steep bank down the Licking River, and about right here on the very edge of the Licking River was an ancient fort. Okay, it was built by pioneers. And there was a mound that was almost beside it here. It doesn't exist there anymore. They've dozed it over. That was the site where the boys dug into and pulled out the 8 and 12 foot skeletons. Okay? All right? Now, there are many other skeletons that have been found. If you were at the Dixon Mound and you went this way, okay, which would be, I think, to the south, you go 1 mile from Dixon Mound to the south, and what you find is another fairly famous mound where they pulled three skeletons out. 2 were 7.5 feet tall, 1 was 8 feet tall. If you ever want to, I could show the newspaper articles about it, all right? So Homer is for a little tiny village, it's a rather interesting place spiritually, okay? It has a lot of stuff that goes on there. Okay, now, matter of fact, there is a New York Times article, May 5th, 1885, that talked about this mound 1 mile south of Homer, the 3 skeletons, like I said, 2 were 7 feet, 1 was 8 foot. So they excavated those out back then, as recorded in the New York Times article. Now, let's go from Ohio Valley and let's move out west for a minute, okay? In the plains and western states, there are innumerable stories, starting out with oral tradition that was then communicated and written down in narratives and books of Native Americans constantly battling, quote, the giant people with light skin and red hair. Okay? Documented in a book called The Six Nations by David Cusick, actually written around 1825, talks about many of these oral traditions. There's another book called The History of the Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Natchez Indians, okay, written by a man named Mr. Cushman, okay, which documents the constant Native American battles with a race of giants that they called the Nahulo. That's what the Native Americans call them. They described these giants as having red hair and who were vicious cannibals. We'll get to that next week in our narrative in Genesis 6 about vicious cannibals. Now, also, there's a book called Native American History by a man named Dr. Yates, who speaks also of the Comanches, all right, which is now in the plains, who battled giants, quote, with white skin, 10 feet tall, and extremely cunning in at warcraft, quote unquote. This, of course, I could go on and on and on. is simply the tip of the iceberg, okay, about all these elements, all these stories of battles with the giants that the Native Americans took on, all the way probably from the, who knows what century, certainly until into the early 19th century. So lots of stories, lots of oral traditions. It's a very, very common thing that was dealt with and talked about. Okay, now I'm going to turn this around.
You're gonna show a skeleton?
Oh, I'm sorry. What did I not show? Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, go to this. This is actually the 7-foot skeleton that was found in that mound just beside Serpent Mound, okay, in Adams County, Ohio. He's missing his legs, if you'll see there. But when they estimate the length of his bones and what is the time below the kneecap and the feet, they would estimate it's about 7 feet tall. Go ahead, see if there's some others I missed here. Oh, this is interesting. This is, quote unquote, the 10 most famous giant skeletons found in America. Okay. It's obviously there was one here. It was found in West Hickory, Pennsylvania, that measured 18 feet tall. That's a big boy. You go in California, there are 12-foot tall ones. Ozarks, 10-foot. Catalina Island, which has many, many, many skeletons, probably a couple thousand skeletons, excavated by Glidden and other archaeologists. Some of them were, like it said, at Catalina were 9 feet 2 inches tall. Miamisburg, Ohio, which would be near Dayton, just south of Dayton. Of course, the Earthworks down there, many mounds, Fort Ancient it's called, and of course they've pulled out of there, skeleton 8 feet 1.5 inch tall. Missouri, Steelsville, 8 foot. Many mounds in Iowa, 7 feet 6 inches. Of course, some of the, how do you pronounce that, Ann? Crescent Mound?
That sounds good.
Okay. Crescent Mound in West Virginia, 7 feet 2 inch skeleton. West Virginia has lots around Charleston, just south of Charleston. There are a lot of mounds down there. There's a very famous mound a little bit north of Charleston, closer to the Ohio River, and that's Moundsville.
Mm-hmm.
It has a huge mound, and they pulled lots of skeletons out of that huge mound. You can go to Moundsville today. It still exists there. You can see it.
Any of these guys with 6 fingers, 6 toes, double row teeth?
Yes. Yeah, and that's reported in other literature that when they looked at these skeletons, there were many of them, not all, but a lot of them, with the double or triple rows of teeth. Okay. Many of them 6 foot. 6 fingers, 6 toes. We didn't pull out for you. We should have maybe tonight, but we were going to pull out all the pictures that my wife and I have taken out west of the petroglyphs of giants. We have hundreds of them, don't we? Okay. So I think that covers a lot of the things I just want to point out. Yeah, we'll go ahead and turn away from the television. I'm going to reposition.
So is this pre-flood stuff or this is after the flood?
Well, it's obviously, it has to be after the flood. Okay.
So when they find these, are these, do they find other articles like they live there, or these were the burial of the giants, or are they just so, they're not finding any other articles of houses or living utensils and things like that?
Well, they don't find houses because the Native Americans never lived in houses. Okay, Native Americans were hunter-gatherer peoples that did some agriculture, okay, but in general, they moved around. They were, in a sense, oddly socialists. Everyone owned the land. No one person owned the land. So they would move based on hunting and agricultural needs all around to different sites. different times of the year, different places. So yeah, we found a zillion artifacts in Ohio, bowls and bronze things and copper things and hatchets. As a matter of fact, we found some hatchets that were incredibly long. We found some spearheads that are incredibly long. And Ohio Historical Museum has some of that stuff. But basically, what we found very little of, interestingly, in the 10,000 mounds that are originally here, is that we haven't found what we'd call normal burials of very many average-sized people, Native Americans. And the ones we find are usually big skeletons. Inside many of these mounds were stone cirques, kind of like altars, which demonstrated that there were rituals that went on there, probably incantations, medicine man, channeling spirits. That certainly probably happened constantly around the mounds. So does that help you?
Yeah, I just was wondering, I didn't know if these were burial sites for the Nephilim, or they were where they lived, or both.
I think you could say it's where the Native Americans, after they killed them, decided to bury them.
Oh,
Because the wars, the oral stories, and even in the Licking County Historical Society, I pulled tons of information out of the Licking County Historical Society sites, and it talks about the wars, that the Native Americans, before the pioneers came, talked about their constant wars with the giant, light-skinned, red-haired people. The reason why the red hair, by the way, if you don't know, is a consistent theme is because when we've gone to Peru and other places and looked at like the Parca, I think it's the Parcas skeletons, Parcas, in Peru, we have tons and tons of elongated skulls, okay, where the measurement of the cranium is at least a third bigger than the human cranium, okay? And of course, some of these have hair attached still to them, and it's consistently red.
They're not giants, so they're elongated, but they're not giants.
We don't know. We don't have the bottom of the. Okay. Well, the thing
Different kind of Nephilims.
Well, let's take since we're off subject, I'm diverting a little bit here, but one of my guys I know, friend of mine, and some of you know L.A. Marzulli. L.A. of course puts out tremendous videos, documentaries, histories. He's traveled all over. He's got a mind like a steel trap. I'll tell you, he's just. L.A. Got permission. Some of the Paracas skulls in Peru, they let him go down and take DNA samples of the skulls. They did it medically with surgical masks so they didn't contaminate anything. They took them from many skeletons. He then had these randomly sent to two different laboratories, one in Canada, one in the United States. And when they did the DNA analysis, they found that there was maternal regular DNA, okay, the mitochondrial DNA, normal human women, but they could not figure out any DNA sequences of the paternal side. None. Couldn't figure it out.
Only one line.
Yeah. And of course the sagittal cuts on the skulls are different with the large skeletons. Anyway, we do have evidence that there's some bizarre things that went on. Okay. Matter of fact, I showed you pictures. I'll just say this of Homer 2 years ago. LA was here in Homer and in Buckeye Lake area, and I kind of hosted him in Homer. We went to the library, we had a room there, and a bunch of us, and actually Fritz Zimmerman, if you want to, Fritz writes tremendous books. He's a good friend of LA, okay? And Fritz was there. Matter of fact, Fritz, I took my book because I was trying to figure stuff out in terms of the plots, and he says, "Give me that book," okay? And so he autographs my book, okay, one of his books. He wrote several books. They're absolutely excellent books. It's got at least 3 of them, matter of fact. You can see there. That's the second one. They're all about the Ohio Valley. Okay, oh, we're gonna pull back for you to see that. You know, tremendous work he's done doing that. Lots of people have spent a lot of time doing that. Now, let's go to Genesis. All right, because I got some material still to cover. All right, we want to go, and let me open up my Bible. We're going to go to Genesis, and we want to look at verse 2 for a second.
Genesis what?
Genesis 6:2. 6:2. Okay. So it says, and we read this last week. This is our famous verses. It says that the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. Okay, now, the sons of God are mentioned in many places in the Old Testament. Let's turn to one of them. Let's go to Job chapter 38. Job chapter 38. Okay. Let me get there. I'm not turning my page as well here. Job 38. We have mentioned this before. We're going to start at verses 4 through 7. He says, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding, who set its measurements? And since you know, who stretched the line on it? And on what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstones?" Verse 7, "When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy." We've talked about these people before. What do we call them?
Angels.
Yes, but we also called them, as we look,
Council?
the divine council. This is really a reference to the divine council, the original council of the angels that God headed up, and they are looking at God's creative work in the universe. Okay? Again, angels, sons of God. Now, we find that one of the objections to the idea that the angels, the sons of God, were angels, okay? Because some people object to this. They don't think the sons of God meant angels. They think somehow the sons of God meant some kind of different people, okay? Certainly, we went through the Hebrew, B'nai Ha Elohim, which only means the sons of God the Father, okay? Those that God fathered, and of course speaks of the angels. Now, if you'll turn, if you would, to the New Testament, Matthew 22. I want to show you one of the objections that people cite, saying that these couldn't be angels that came down to the earth, okay? Matthew 22. And we're going to look at verse 30. He's talking about the resurrection. He's disputing this issue with the Pharisees and Sadducees, okay? Verse 30, "For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven." Now, people that dispute the fallen angel theory, the fallen angel viewpoint, better than theory, in Genesis 6, state that this, to them, says that angels cannot marry. Therefore, the fallen angels could have not come down to the earth and had intercourse with women to produce the Nephilim, okay? But that's not really what it says.
Right.
What it says is, after the resurrection of the believers, no person will marry because we will be in a state or form, quote, like the angels in heaven. That's what it actually says. Okay? It doesn't make a statement that there's no way that angels could possibly in some way procreate. We'll get to that because we're going to see further evidence. Now, in Genesis 18, this is a story of Abraham and Sarah. Okay? And in this story, 3 individuals show up at their tent. Okay? Abraham immediately recognizes them, these, quote, 3 people. He shows them hospitality. He bids them to stay. He gives them a meal. And as we move on in the verses, one of them is called the Lord. Who would that be?
Jesus.
Probably pre-incarnate Christ, okay? He's accompanied by 2 angels, okay? And obviously, from the text, you can see they take human form. Lest how could he feed them and all those things. Now, in the next chapter, Genesis 19, we have the story of these 2 angels who leave Abraham's place and go down to Sodom and Gomorrah, and they visit Lot. In the story, Lot sees them. He immediately recognizes they're divine. Okay? He urges them to quickly come inside the house. Okay? If you'll read the text, I'm not going to read it all to you, but if you read it. So they come in, he fixes them a meal which it says they eat the meal. So they obviously have a humanoid form to do this. But the men of Sodom come to Lot's house and insist they want sexual relations with these, quote, 2 men that are angels. Lot, of course, immediately recognizes them, calls them lords, and sees that they are divine. So the question, interestingly enough, is why is it when the people of Sodom see these 2 angelic beings come to Lot's house, they immediately come to the house and desire to have intercourse with them?
Because they're human form.
Does it sound familiar
Yeah.
that someone wants to have a hybrid situation between angels and humans? It's another example of Satan's strategy, okay, to somehow mix in some way human and, quote, fallen angel DNA. Now, let's go to Jude 6. Or Jude 1:6, I'm sorry, well, Jude verse 6. Okay, go to Jude. This is a very, very interesting passage that sadly I think very few people seem to interpret correctly in the ancient language. Now, let me read the verse. And angels who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, is kept in eternal bonds under darkness for the judgment of the great day. That's the verse. Let's take it apart. Okay? It speaks of a group of angels. Clearly, does it not? Okay? Who, it says, abandoned, quote, or did not keep their own domain. Okay? The word in Greek is arche, or archei, and it means a designed place, a principality, which we would interpret as a dimension, okay, an abode. So they did not keep that place that they were created to be in, but they, quote, left it. The word for left in the Greek there is apolypo, and it means to desert, to abandon, to leave, or to forsake. Okay? Then it says they forsook their, quote, own habitation. This word in the Greek is oiketerion, and it means specifically a body or a form which is the dwelling place for one's soul or spirit. Okay? So what does it say?
Morphed into something else.
It says they left their dimension in heaven where they were supposed to be. They came to a dimension in which they were not to be, and they changed their form into a form that was not meant to be because it wasn't their natural angel body. They took on humanoid form. That's what the verse says in the Greek. Right?
Yeah.
Sound like a familiar story? Genesis 6. Okay. Now, we also see, if you want to look here, why don't you turn back to your left from Jude to 2 Corinthians 5. 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And we see Paul saying a very interesting thing. For we know, verse 1, for we know that if the earthly tent, which is our house, is torn down, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. What's the word earthly tent? Oikiterion. The exact same word of the fact that the angels took on this body form.
So again, what does oikiterion mean?
Oikiterion means a body, a form, which is a dwelling place for a soul spirit. That's what oikiterion means. So here we're told a different thing.
So can we say our body is oikiterion?
Yeah.
Holy Spirit?
And there's going to be another oikiterion. Okay, and that's what he's just talking about here. When we get to heaven and we're given a resurrection body, that's a new oikiterion. It's not an earthly one. It's going to be a heavenly one.
So it's like a vessel for the spirit.
It's a vessel for the body and for the soul and spirit. For the soul and spirit. Okay, now, angels, it says that who did this, forsook their own designed angelic bodies to come into this dimensionality, as I said, take on a humanoid form. This explains why they could end up having sexual relations with human women. Just like the angels in Genesis 18 could eat and stay and be touched and all that stuff, okay? We don't have to look at this, but we also see a similar concept stated in 1 Corinthians 15, verses 39 to 40, where Paul there talks about the difference between celestial bodies and, the bodies of angels versus human bodies. He talks about bodies of fish, bodies of this, bodies of that, and he says there's bodies of angels. So angels originally are meant to stay in their own unique body form. This divine body form. Now, interestingly, as we saw here in Jude, that God, of course, condemns this group, and he says that he chained them, okay? The word there is to this place called Zoditos. Zoditos in Greek means a darkness of the nether world. And of course, we know where that is because we looked last week at Revelation 9, okay, and what these angels, they were bound into this place, and it's called, of course, there, Tartarus. Now, why such a strict judgment of God on these fallen angels? Because their purpose was to come down and to corrupt human DNA so that the promise of Genesis 3:15 of a Messiah being born couldn't happen. It was a very specific satanic strategy. Make sense? All right. Now, let's go back to Genesis 6:3. Genesis 6:3. Let me read it again. The Lord said, my spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he's also flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. What this appears to mean, although there are some different opinions about it, but what it appears to mean is that the pre-flood patriarchal line of Seth, especially, that lived off in 800 to 900 years, but God says at this point, because of what happened in Genesis 6, that he's got to limit human life to approximately a maximum of 120 years. That is, he can't let people get evil and live 800 or 900 years. He's got to make certain that they don't live that long because of the evil that was going on. Now, let's talk about Nephilim, okay? In the Septuagint, the Greek version of the Old Testament, the word for Nephilim is gigantus. Make sense? Gigantus. The Hebrew root for Nephilim is Nephil, and it means to fall, implying down, fall down, come down, okay? It is also connected to a noun named Nephiphel, which means, interestingly, from clouds. So the word in its various forms seems to imply those who fall upon or fall down from and come down to the earth from above, quote unquote, the clouds. Now, fall down also is a strong indication of predatory mighty beings, which of course we see attempt to start a new race on the earth. What we call them hybrids, right? The hybrids between humans and angels. It also says, if you'll notice, it says that let's go to verse 4, Genesis 4. This is, of course, talking about that the Nephilim come down, they take women, have sexual relations with them, and sons are born, which of course are called the Nephilim. And then it says they were mighty men of old, men of renown. Now, mighty men in Hebrew is the word gibor, and it means to be strong, brave, powerful. It's described as tyrant warriors, people who are large and audacious and are hunters of things. I think both animals and men, in my opinion, we'll see. But it also says that they were, quote, men of renown. The Hebrew word is sim, and it means beings of fame, reputation, notoriety, and those that are, quote, infamous. So this describes what we talked about last week, the stories of the Anunnaki, of Gilgamesh, who of course was a giant. It speaks of the Greek titans and the Greek giants. It speaks of people like Odysseus, Hercules, Theseus, Perseus, okay, and all these individuals were these mighty men, men of renown. It also is the same word found in Genesis 10, verses 8 and 9, that speak about this guy named Nimrod, who we'll get to. So what do you think he is? Hybrid, a giant, okay? Now, it's interesting, further New Testament support, and I'm not going to go to these verses, I'll give them to you, but further New Testament support for the fallen angel narrative is found also in 1 Peter 3, verses 19 and 20, and in 2 Peter 2, verses 4 and 5. So it's spoken of in the Old Testament, it's spoken of in the New Testament. And of course, it connects the fallen angels in Genesis 6. Now, let me just go a couple more minutes and I'll stop. The Nephilim seem to die in Noah's flood, in the great flood. It's meant to wipe them out. It's meant to cleanse the earth of corrupted DNA. And of course, we read, and we'll get to it, there's only 8 people left, apparently, that is Noah and his family, who don't have corrupted DNA. And of course, they're put in an ark to, of course, survive this. The question that I think we want to ask about this is, so what happens when the Nephilim bodies die to the soul and spirit? What happens to them?
Wandering stars.
Demons.
Okay.
They have no refuge.
Now, let's look at, there's several verses about this. I'm just going to give them to you, and I want to look at just one. Psalm 88:10 speaks about them. It calls them the Rapha, Okay, the Rapha. That's the Hebrew word. It means literally in Hebrew, spiritually dead, dead entities, shades, or ghosts. That's what it means in Hebrew. Those that dwell in a netherworld. The book called Enoch, which I have great reverence for, okay? The book Enoch, in chapter 15, verses 8 through 12, Enoch states that the demons are departed spirits of the dead giants, quote, trapped on the earth. Okay? They can't get off.
Say it again.
The demons are the departed spirits of the giants that are trapped on the earth. I think this is why, and I went through it last week, and I'm not going to go through it again, why there's a unique nature to Jesus' dealings in Mark 5 with this being who has, quote, legion demons. I think it alludes to Genesis 6:4 about the Nephilim on the earth. It also states that the Nephilim were on the earth and also afterward. Do you see it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And also afterward. Now, this is a very interesting statement. The word is achar, okay, in Hebrew, and it means after what had just occurred. Therefore, I think what it's referring to is after the flood. So it says, interestingly, that somehow, in some way, giants, in some way, either survive or are reconstituted after the flood. Now, how many did this happen? Did this occur to? We don't know. You know, how big are the ones after the flood? Well, we have some idea from the skeletons that we have. They're maybe 7 to 12 feet tall usually, okay? And of course, there are many theories of how this could have occurred. There's a ton of them, but the answer is we don't know. But there is something we do know. Turn to Numbers 13. And here's what we do know. Verse 33. This is about the spies sent out that spy out the land before the children of Israel entered during the conquest of Joshua. They say, there also we saw the Nephilim, quote, or in parentheses, the sons of Anak. They're also part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight. The scripture tells us very specifically that the descendants of the Nephilim end up being in Israel when they start to come into it. Clear? Now, I want to explain something to you. That there are subtypes of the Nephilim, clans. Some of them are called, as you saw here, the sons of Anak. Now the question is, who's Anak?
He was a king.
Well, let's go to the book of Joshua for just a second, and then we'll close. Let's go to Joshua 14. The Bible always defines the Bible, right? If you have a question, it's probably the answer's in here somewhere. Joshua 14, verse 15. Now, the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath Arba, for Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. So, Kiriath Arba is the ancient territory that later would be called in the tribe of Judah, Hebron, the city of Hebron. And there was this giant there whose name was Arba. Now, go to the next chapter of Joshua, go to 15. And we're going to read verse 13. This is the allotment of the land. Now Joshua gave to Caleb, the son of Jephthah, a portion among the sons of Judah, according to the command of the Lord that was made to Joshua. Namely, he gave him Kiriath Arba, Arba being the father of Anak, that is, in Hebron. So now you know who spread or had or developed the clan of the Anakim. It was this giant Arba. And he has a son who's a giant called Anak. Make sense to you?
So Kiriath Arba was giant.
Kiriath Arba was the territory of this particular clan of giants.
And Arba was a giant.
Giant was the Arba. It was the giant, right?
Now called Hebron.
Okay, now called Hebron. Now, one more thing. I want you to turn to Judges chapter 1, right after Joshua. You're real close. Judges chapter 1. And we're going to read verse 10. So Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron formerly was, as we've seen, Kiriath Arba. And they struck down Sheshai and Ammon and Talmi. Okay?
They're giants.
These are giants. They are the sons of Anak. Okay? Big boys. The Judites finally killed them. Now, the Bible records other giant clans besides the Anakim. It talks about the Emim. It talks about the Zerzumim. It talks about the Raphaim. Their names mean different things and indicate things about them. Like I think it's the Emim are called the long neck ones. Okay? It kind of describes descriptive things about them.
What about King Og?
Og was also, we know, a giant. We don't know exactly from which clan he came from, to my knowledge, but okay. Now, here's the point. Why did these giants settle in Israel? Why did they go north to Mesopotamia and east? Why didn't they settle in the Iraq area? Why didn't they settle in Babylon? Why here?
To mix
Right.
with Jewish.
Say it again.
To tarnish the line?
That's it, but there's another reason.
It was the promised land.
Exactly.
Abraham.
Because Abraham's promise, which we'll go through in weeks ahead, was to a people and a land, and it's defined geographically what the dimensions of that land will be. Satan collects them in this area so that in his mind, when the Jews leave Egypt and come into the land, he thinks that he can prevent the Jews from taking over the land. So it was a very clear satanic strategy. Now, next week, we'll start at Genesis 6:5, and we'll learn more about the pre-flood elements in the world. We'll learn about God's plan through Noah, and we'll talk more about the nature of the flood. So, there's a little information for you tonight.
But there were also giants in Crete.
Oh, yes. They
All
eventually
around.
spread all over.
Yeah, that's
All over.
concentrated.
But their first
Israel.
drop-off zone was Israel. Okay? All right. Michael, would you pray for us again tonight? Close.
Heavenly Father, we do thank you once again this evening for your word. It is the depth and the width and the breadth of it, Father, is just beyond our imagination. Lord, when we hear Tim expound all these things and apply them to what we know, even connected to modern science, all that, Lord, if the evidence is really irrefutable. God, we thank you that not only do we see these things and know these things historically, but we're glad that we know you, Father. We know you personally. And Lord, through your Son, Jesus Christ, he gave himself for us. So we just ask you, as we continue our study, that we learn and we be able to apply anything and everything, Father, that we find in there for us as far as the principles for living
Yes.
and walking in this Christian
Yes.
life. In Jesus' name.
Amen.